It is March 7, 1945. Imagine the scene. We are on the wooded heights overlooking the ancient German town of Remagen. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint metallic tang of distant battle. A stubborn haze, a remnant of the morning's fog, still clings to the Rhine Valley below, softening the hard edges of a war-torn landscape. Here among the trees stands Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman of the U.S. 9th Armored Division. He raises a pair of heavy field binoculars to his eyes. His hands, veterans of countless cold mornings and tense firefights, are trembling. But this tremor isn't from the chill, and it isn't from fear. It is a tremor born of profound, heart-stopping disbelief. Through the lenses, his world swims into focus. He sweeps past the scarred hillsides and the skeletal ruins of the town below, his gaze settling on the broad, slate-gray expanse of the Rhine River. And then he sees it. It's a sight that defies all logic, a vision that contradicts every single intelligence report and upends every tactical assumption made over the last 6 grueling months of war. The bridge still stands. One bridge, the only bridge. For months, every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had been under the most explicit draconian orders imaginable. Destroy all crossings before the Allies can reach them. The Rhine was to be the last great barrier, Germany's final unbreachable moat, behind which the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht could regroup. Yet there it was, the Ludendorff Bridge. Its twin stone towers rise like somber, defiant monuments to German engineering, its dark steel arches stretching over 300 meters of the fast-flowing, formidable river. Standing beside Enderman, a young lieutenant named Karl Timmerman gives voice to the thought that would soon electrify the entire Allied command. He speaks in a low tone, a mixture of awe and raw urgency. We have to take it, right now, before they blow it to hell. In that single breathtaking moment, none of them could possibly grasp the full magnitude of what they were seeing. They were soldiers focused on the next objective. They couldn't know that the capture of this one structure would trigger the most catastrophic strategic collapse in German military history. They couldn't know that this bridge would become a psychological wrecking ball, demolishing Nazi defensive doctrine so completely that German officers would later describe this very moment as the instant they knew, with absolute soul-crushing certainty, that the war was lost. The story of this pivotal moment, however, wasn't being written in the blood of soldiers. Not yet. It was being written on the grand, unforgiving chessboard of strategy, in the cold, hard calculus of military geometry. You must understand, the Rhine was never just a river. For centuries it was a fortress granted by nature. 300 meters of fast-flowing, churning water, a current swift enough to capsize assault boats, a depth that could swallow an entire armored division, and banks so steep they could become a death trap for any infantry that managed to make it across. It was Germany's very bloodstream and its final, most formidable shield, since the days the Roman legions stood on its western bank, gazing into the dark, foreboding Germanic forests. The Rhine had stood as a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. In the dying winter of 1945, this river represented Adolf Hitler's final, desperate hope. It was a barrier that could buy him what he craved most: time. Time to perhaps sue for a separate negotiated peace with the Western Allies. Time to transfer his shattered divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front for one last, Götterdämmerung-style stand in the heart of the Reich. The presence of a single intact bridge would shatter that grand, delusional calculation in less than 10 minutes of combat. The context for this catastrophe had been building for months, forged in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final great gamble in the West, had ended in an unmitigated disaster by late January. What German propaganda had hailed as a decisive counteroffensive had, in reality, been a funeral pyre for the Wehrmacht's offensive capability. 100,000 German casualties, 600 tanks and assault guns lost forever, and most critically, the irreplaceable, battle-hardened veterans of the panzer divisions were gone. What remained of the German armies west of the Rhine were now hollow shells, ghosts of their former terrifying strength. By early March, 12 American divisions were surging towards the river along a massive front, a tidal wave of men and steel. Facing this onslaught, the German 15th Army could muster barely 50,000 exhausted, ill-equipped troops against an Allied force 5 times its size. The strategic chessboard was no longer a game of equals. It was the final, crushing endgame. To understand what happened at Remagen, you must first understand the bridge itself, a structure steeped in a bitter, almost poetic irony. A ghost of the First World War haunted its very name. General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately failed strategist. But the deepest irony was forged into its very steel. It had been built between 1916 and 1919, largely by the hands of Russian prisoners of war. Men working under brutal, unforgiving conditions had, in a cruel twist of fate, constructed their prison far too well. It was a brute of a bridge. Its steel trusses were designed to carry the immense weight of fully loaded military supply trains, an artery of war designed to feed the Western Front. With remarkable foresight, its original German engineers had even built demolition chambers directly into its massive stone piers, hollow cavities waiting to be packed with explosives. But after the war, French occupation forces, wanting to deny Germany any future military advantage, had methodically filled every single one of those chambers with solid concrete. When Hitler retook the Rhineland in 1936, his engineers had to improvise. They retrofitted the bridge, attaching 60 heavy zinc-lined boxes to its main girders, each designed to hold a powerful explosive charge. The system was meticulously wired, engineered to detonate as one, dropping the entire 300-meter span into the Rhine in a single catastrophic instant. It was, in theory, foolproof, but then fate and Adolf Hitler's corrosive paranoia intervened. In October 1944, a single stray American bomb struck the Milheim Bridge in Cologne. It detonated the pre-positioned German demolition charges, destroying the bridge prematurely. In his bunker, Hitler's rage was volcanic. He saw incompetence and treason everywhere. He ordered the immediate court-martial of the officers responsible and issued a new fatal decree that would ripple across the front. From that moment on, all demolition charges on the Rhine bridges were to be removed and stored nearby. They could only be replaced when the enemy was within 8 kilometers, and even then, a bridge could only be destroyed by a direct, written order from a sector commander. This order was a signature of Hitler's paranoia, and it created an impossible psychological vice for every German officer on the Rhine. Blow a bridge too soon, and you face a court-martial for destroying a vital escape route. Wait a second too long, and you face a firing squad for treason. This crippling pressure froze German decision-making at the very moment decisive. Swift action was most critical. The American advance rolling towards this fateful encounter was codenamed Operation Lumberjack, a modest, almost rustic name for what would become one of the most consequential military movements of the entire war. The primary objectives were the great Rhine cities of Cologne and Koblenz. Spearheading this powerful thrust was the American First Army, under the quiet and methodical Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. His forces were a juggernaut, driving relentlessly eastward through the Eifel region, facing a German resistance that had degraded from an organized defense into a series of desperate, chaotic, delaying actions. German commanders had no illusions about stopping the Americans. Their orders were simply to delay, to buy precious hours for more troops to retreat across the Rhine before the bridges were inevitably blown. Leading this charge, the very tip of the spear, was Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division. They were a unit that had earned a fearsome and fitting nickname, the Phantom Division. German intelligence, time and time again, had confidently reported them destroyed or crippled, only for them to reappear days later, intact and attacking a completely different sector with renewed fury. They were relentless, a ghostly armored formation that the collapsing Wehrmacht simply could not pin down. As the Phantoms neared Remagen, the morning of March 7th began with a thick, disorienting fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. While it shrouded the American advance, it was a perfect metaphor for the state of the German command structure, which had descended into a level of chaos that would have been unthinkable in the hyper-efficient Wehrmacht of 1940. General von Rothkirch, the corps commander responsible for the entire Remagen sector, had gotten lost the day before, accidentally wandered into American lines, and was now a prisoner of war. His appointed replacement, General Richard von Bothmer, couldn't even reach his new command because American armored columns had already cut all the roads. The responsibility for the bridge fell through this command vacuum. At 1 o'clock in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld, 64 kilometers away from Remagen, was abruptly informed that he was now in charge of defending the Ludendorff Bridge, a structure he had never even seen. His response was to dispatch his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, on a desperate nighttime mission to take command. Scheller's journey through the darkness was a nightmare of wrong turns, American roadblocks, and fuel shortages. He wouldn't arrive at Remagen until late morning, just 2 hours before the Phantom Division would crest the final hill. As the American armor drew closer, the fate of the bridge rested in the hands of a few men, each trapped in their own moment of history. The man with the heaviest burden, the German commandant actually on site at Remagen, was Captain Willy Bratsche. He commanded a force that existed more on paper than in reality. His official roster listed 600 men, a respectable garrison. His actual combat power on that fateful morning consisted of just 36 soldiers. It was a pathetic scraped-together force. Most were either recently wounded and unfit for the front line, elderly men from the Home Guard conscripted in the war's final days, or young terrified boys from the Volkssturm militia, armed with little more than fanaticism and faulty rifles. Worse still, many were Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to wear the German uniform simply to escape the slow death of the prison camps. Their will to fight and die for the Third Reich against the well-fed, well-armed Americans was, to put it mildly, highly questionable. For weeks, Captain Bratsche had been pleading, sending frantic messages up a chain of command that was deaf and disintegrating. He begged for reinforcements, for proper radios, for anything that might help him defend a strategic asset that everyone in the German high command seemed to have forgotten until the enemy was at the gate. His requests vanished into the bureaucratic void of a collapsing regime. On the American side, the approach had an element of accidental destiny. The lead assault element was commanded by Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a 22-year-old platoon leader. In a perfect, almost unbelievable quirk of history, Timmermann had been born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1922, and had immigrated to the United States with his parents as an infant. He spoke fluent German. As he stood on the heights looking down at the bridge, he understood the profound, symbolic significance of what he was seeing perhaps better than anyone. This wasn't just another target on a map. It was a physical link to the country of his birth, a country he was now fighting to defeat. This was not just a bridge. It was the last barrier's failure, the final great obstacle about to be overcome not by a massive, bloody assault, but by an incredible stroke of luck and the enemy's total, crippling paralysis. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, the commander of Combat Command B, Brigadier General William Hodge, arrived on the heights. He was a plain-spoken, decisive engineer by training, a man who understood structures and opportunities. He looked through his binoculars, and in a single electrifying moment, he grasped the full, breathtaking implications. This wasn't just about getting a few battalions across the Rhine. This was a chance to bypass Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned, massive Rhine crossing and vault 3 weeks ahead of the entire Allied schedule. He made the decision that would define his military career and alter the course of the war. He turned to his officers and issued a terse, history-making command. "We're taking that bridge. Now." For the German defenders, the world was about to end. Just as the American attack was ordered, the thick fog that had cloaked the valley all morning began to burn away, a final, cruel twist of fate. For American artillery observers, it was a gift, granting them perfect, crystal-clear visibility of every German position. At 3:15 p.m., the assault began with a thunderous roar. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of brand-new M26 Pershing tanks, the most powerful American tanks in Europe, led the charge into Remagen. To the German defenders, these were terrifying monolithic beasts they had never seen before. Armed with high-velocity 90mm guns, they were the apex predators of the battlefield. The Pershings fired white phosphorus shells that burst in brilliant searing flashes, creating a dense, choking smokescreen. They hammered German machine gun nests with high-explosive rounds, blowing apart buildings with contemptuous ease. Behind this armored onslaught, Lieutenant Timmerman's infantry followed, moving fast through the scarred streets of the once picturesque resort town. The fight for Remagen itself was brutally short, lasting less than 30 minutes. The few German soldiers who tried to put up a defense were quickly overwhelmed, falling back in a panicked retreat towards the bridge. Watching the American tanks closing in, Captain Bragg knew the moment had come. From his position near the bridge's western tower, he gave his final effective order. At 3:20, he yelled for the demolition charge on the western approach ramp to be blown. The resulting explosion was deafening, tearing a 3-meter crater in the roadway. It was enough to stop the American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge, but the main structure, the great prize, remained standing, waiting. The race for the Ludendorff Bridge had just begun. The scene on the Ludendorff Bridge becomes one of concentrated, violent chaos. From the western bank, American tanks unleash a torrent of fire, their 90mm cannons pounding the German positions on the far side. On the eastern heights, dug into the sheer basalt cliff known as the Erpeler, German anti-aircraft gunners desperately depress their cannons, turning them into direct-fire artillery, raking the open steelwork of the bridge with a storm of explosive shells. At 3:50 p.m., Lieutenant Timmerman gives the order. His infantry, about 120 men from A Company, begin their terrifying advance across the 300-meter span. It is a mad dash into the teeth of death. They move in short, breathless rushes, the steel plates vibrating under their boots, using the stone towers and heavy girders for what little cover they can find. German machine guns open up from the eastern towers and from the dark maw of the railway tunnel beyond. Bullets shriek and spark off the steel, creating a deadly ricocheting crossfire. Men fall, their bodies crumpling on the exposed walkway. The rest keep coming. On the eastern side, inside the dark, echoing tunnel, Major Scheller faces the most consequential decision of his life. The bridge is loaded with explosives. The electrical detonation system is ready. American troops are now halfway across. Every instinct, every rule of military doctrine screams at him to give the order, to blow the bridge now. But just minutes earlier, an artillery lieutenant named Karl Peters had made a desperate plea. Peters commanded a battery of top-secret Henschel HS-297 rocket launchers, and his unit was still scrambling across the bridge. He could not allow this advanced technology to fall into American hands. Scheller, against his better judgment, makes a fatal choice. He agrees to wait just a few more minutes. Finally, Peters's battery clears the bridge. Scheller gives the order to the combat engineer, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, who is crouched over the electrical detonator. At approximately 4 p.m., with American soldiers now 2/3 of the way across, Friesenhahn takes a deep breath and turns the heavy key. Nothing happens. A stunned, deafening silence in the German tunnel, broken only by the continuing crack of rifles from the bridge. The electrical system has failed. A stray American artillery shell, in a 1 in a million shot, had likely cut the wire. In that moment of German failure, American history was made. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a 34-year-old former butcher from Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since the Napoleonic Wars. He sprinted across the remaining length of the bridge, a lone figure plunging into the smoke and dust on the far side. Behind him, Timmerman and the rest of a company kept coming, a relentless wave of olive drab, securing the bridgehead. Immediately, American engineers, led by Sergeant Eugene Dorland, swarmed onto the span. Their mission was terrifyingly simple: find and cut every single wire connected to the demolition charges. They moved with frantic precision, knowing the Germans must have a backup, and they did. A German engineer, Corporal Anton Faust, volunteered for a suicide mission, He burst out of the tunnel, dashing across 100 meters of open ground under a hail of American fire. He reached the backup fuse and ignited it by hand. At 4:15 p.m., a massive explosion ripped through the southern side of the bridge. The entire structure heaved upwards like a wounded beast, lifting several inches off its stone foundations before crashing back down. Smoke and debris billowed into the sky. For a heart-stopping moment, everyone thought it was over. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge miraculously still stood. The main steel arches were damaged, twisted, but they remained intact. The roadway sagged, but it was passable. The bridge had held. The race was over. The aftermath was controlled chaos. German resistance collapsed instantly. Captain Bradge and hundreds of his remaining men, their will to fight extinguished, were captured in the 400-meter railway tunnel. Realizing the disaster was complete, Major Scheller, the man who would be blamed for it all, commandeered a bicycle and rode east into the gathering dusk, hoping to explain the impossible. The news of the bridge's capture didn't travel up the American chain of command. It detonated. It was a shockwave of victory that moved with the speed of an electrical current, jolting generals and planners hundreds of miles from the front. At 5:00 p.m., a breathless voice came over the radio to Major General John Leonard, the commander of the 9th Armored. It was his subordinate, Brigadier General Hogue, with 5 simple, miraculous words that would change the war. "We got the bridge." Leonard immediately relayed the astonishing news to 1st Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was in a tense staff meeting, poring over maps of the intractable Rhine barrier. Witnesses say he grabbed the telephone receiver so quickly and with such force that he knocked his full coffee mug across a table of priceless strategic maps. Within minutes, he was on the line to the commander of the entire 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley. Bradley was in a meeting of his own when an aide burst in, signaling an urgent call. On the line, Hodges' voice was crackling with an excitement that was utterly out of character for the famously reserved general. "Brad, we've got a bridge," he said. Bradley, stunned, couldn't process it at first. "A bridge?" he asked, standing up from his desk. "You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" "Yep," Hodges confirmed. "Nabbed one at Remagen before they could blow it up." Bradley's response became an immortal piece of American military legend. Forgetting all military decorum, he yelled into the phone with pure, unadulterated joy. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust 'em wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," Hodges replied. The final call went from Bradley to the Supreme Allied Commander himself, Dwight D. Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Reims, France. Ike grasped the monumental significance in a heartbeat. He later wrote that the capture of the bridge was one of those rare and fleeting opportunities which occasionally arise in war, and which, if grasped, have incalculable effects. Eisenhower's entire strategic plan for ending the war in Europe had just been turned on its head. The main crossing of the Rhine was supposed to be Montgomery's massive set-piece operation in the north. Remagen changed everything. Eisenhower gave Bradley a single decisive order: exploit the bridgehead, divert every available unit. In a matter of hours, a single bridge had rewritten the final chapter of the war in Europe. When the news reached Adolf Hitler in the stale concrete confines of his Führer bunker in Berlin, his response was a terrifying cocktail of strategic despair and homicidal rage. For weeks he had been clinging to the increasingly delusional hope that the Rhine, the sacred German river, would hold. It was the Great Wall that would buy him the time he needed to salvage his collapsing Reich. The news that an American bridgehead was now firmly established on the eastern bank, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, demolished that fantasy entirely. His immediate violent instinct was not to strategize, but to punish. He needed scapegoats. He needed blood. He summoned Generalleutnant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi known for his utter ruthlessness on the Eastern Front. Hübner was given command of a newly created and chillingly named Flying Special Court-Martial. It was not a court of justice. It was a traveling execution squad with judicial pretensions, its sole purpose to find officers to blame and put them against a wall. When offered copies of the German military code of justice, Hübner contemptuously waved them away, declaring that the only authority he needed was a direct order from his Führer. The wrath reached the very highest echelons of command. On March 10th, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic commander of all German forces in the West, was summarily dismissed, a scapegoat of appropriate rank for a disaster of this magnitude. He was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, a capable tactician known as Hitler's firefighter, hastily transferred from the front in Italy. But even Kesselring knew this was a fire that could not be put out. He later called the loss of the bridge the crime of Remagen, stating flatly that it broke the front along the Rhine and made any sustained defense impossible. The head of the rapidly disintegrating Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, was even more blunt. The capture of the bridge, he said, made a long defense impossible. For the German officer corps, who had clung to some sliver of professional hope, the news from Remagen, followed by the wave of terror from Berlin, was the final devastating psychological blow. The war was lost, and now the regime was beginning to eat its own. The flying court-martial began its work with murderous efficiency. It was a ghastly legal pantomime, a series of sham trials where guilt was predetermined, and the only variable was the date of execution. The first to face the court was General Major Richard von Bothmer, the man who had nominal command of the sector, but had never even reached the bridge. Convicted of dereliction of duty, his wife already dead, and his son killed in the war, he saw no honor left. After hearing his sentence, he grabbed an officer's pistol in the courtroom and took his own life. On March 11th, the court arrived at Field Marshal Model's headquarters. 4 more officers were brought forward, their trials lasting less than an hour each. Major Hans Scheller, the 31-year-old career officer sent on a fool's errand, was convicted of failing to blow the bridge, despite having arrived just 2 hours before the attack with only 36 exhausted soldiers. Lieutenant Karl Peters was convicted of allowing his secret rocket launchers to be captured, the very act of trying to save them having caused the fatal delay. 2 combat engineers, Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobli, were convicted of insufficient preparation of the demolition system, despite having laid the charges days earlier and being 60 kilometers away when the bridge was taken. All 4 men were sentenced to death. On March 14, 1945, in the cold forests near the small villages of Rimbach and Oberiersen, the sentences were carried out. The 4 officers were led into the woods, forced to kneel in the damp earth, and shot in the back of the neck. They were buried where they fell, in unmarked shallow graves, their names erased in an act of institutional rage. The ultimate irony was reserved for the men who had been closest to the action. Captain Willy Bratke, who had actually commanded the bridge defense, and Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had turned the key on the failed detonator, were both tried in their absence and sentenced. But they were already prisoners of war, safe in American custody. The scapegoats had been executed while the principal actor survived. Field Marshal Model personally endorsed the executions, ordering that news of them be distributed to every unit in the German military. The message was chillingly clear. In the Third Reich's final days, failure, regardless of circumstance, would be punished by death. While German officers were being executed for losing the bridge, American forces were pouring across it in a torrent of men and steel that did not stop, day or night. The structure groaned and shuddered under the immense strain, but it held. Realizing their prize was living on borrowed time, American combat engineers immediately began a furious race against time, constructing tactical pontoon and treadway bridges alongside the battered original. The plan was simple. Make the Remagen bridgehead permanent, make it irreversible. The German response was a furious, desperate attempt to destroy what they had lost. throwing every weapon they had left, including their most secret and advanced technology, at the crossing. The Luftwaffe, a shadow of its former self, launched wave after wave of attacks. For the first time in history, jet aircraft were used in concentrated bombing runs. Arado R-234s, the world's first jet bombers, screamed in at over 800 kilometers per hour. Sleek Messerschmitt, Me-262 jet fighters flashed through the sky. In response, the Americans assembled the largest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery of the entire war, creating a deadly box of flak that turned the sky over Remagen into a churning wall of steel. From secret launch sites in the Netherlands, Hitler personally authorized the use of his ultimate vengeance weapon, the V-2 rocket. For the first and only time, this strategic ballistic missile, designed to terrorize London, was aimed at a single tactical target. 11 V-2s were launched, not one hit the bridge. The Germans even brought up the monstrous Karl Gerät, a 600mm super heavy siege mortar that fired shells weighing over 2 tons. The few that were fired missed. Under the cover of darkness, naval frogmen slipped into the cold Rhine to attach mines, only to be detected and killed or captured. Every failed German attack had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of inspiring terror, it reinforced American morale. The GIs fighting in the bridgehead understood they were witnessing the spectacular death throes of the Wehrmacht. Every exotic new weapon that failed was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The Ludendorff Bridge, the celebrated prize of Remagen, finally gave up its long fight on the afternoon of March 17th, 10 days after its miraculous capture. For 10 days and 10 nights, it had endured a level of punishment its builders had never conceived. It had shuddered under the non-stop percussive rhythm of thousands of American tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces rolling across its deck. It had been scarred by direct hits from German shells, shaken to its core by the near misses of bombs and V-2 rockets, and permanently weakened by the shock of the failed German demolition attempt. It was a wounded giant, dying slowly on its feet. In the hours before the end, the American engineers working on its span heard the warning signs. Witnesses reported hearing rivets, stressed beyond their limits, popping like rifle shots, sharp metallic cracks echoing across the river. It was the sound of the bridge's very skeleton beginning to snap. At approximately 3:00 in the afternoon, the moment came. A crucial vertical hanger on the southern arch, fatigued and overstrained, snapped with a loud bang. A second later, another gave way. A terrible chain reaction began. The entire center span of the bridge seemed to lift for a brief, eerie moment, as if taking one last breath before it twisted and fell into the Rhine with a deafening, cataclysmic roar that could be heard for kilometers. On the bridge at that exact moment were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, working desperately to shore up the weakened sections. 28 of them died in the collapse and over 60 more were injured. The irony was bitter and tragic. These men, who had bravely disarmed the German demolition charges and worked around the clock to keep the bridge open, became its final casualties. Their final enemy was not a German soldier, but the very structure they had fought so hard to save. But by the time the old bridge fell, its historic job was done. It had become strategically irrelevant. Nearby, 2 heavy-duty tactical bridges were already complete, and a third was nearly finished. The flow of American power to the eastern bank never stopped. In fact, it increased. The Ludendorff Bridge had been the key that unlocked the door to the heart of Germany. Once that door was kicked open and wedged, the key itself was no longer needed. On March 25th, the dam finally broke. For 18 days, American power had been pouring across the Rhine, cramming men and machines into the Remagen bridgehead. Now it was time to unleash them. The breakout began not as an attack but as an explosion. American armored divisions, which had been coiled like powerful springs within the perimeter, suddenly shot eastward into the heart of Germany. It was a blitzkrieg in reverse, executed with a speed and ferocity that left the German command structure utterly shattered. The sheer velocity of the advance was breathtaking. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, The same unit that had taken the bridge covered 108 kilometers in a single day. Another combat command advanced 110 kilometers in just 11 hours. German resistance, which had been so fierce and desperate in the narrow confines around the bridge, simply evaporated across the wider front. Entire German units, cut off and leaderless, surrendered en masse. On March 29th, a single American combat command captured more than 2,200 prisoners in a single engagement. For the German commanders, the situation descended into chaos. They lost track of their own units. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. Corps lost contact with Army commands. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, which had numbered some 325,000 men, began to disintegrate where it stood. Model, one of Germany's finest defensive strategists, found himself in an impossible position, commanding a ghost army that was simultaneously being encircled and bypassed. The American armored columns were not just advancing, they were forming two great steel pincers. Their objective, the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the source of 80% of its coal and steel production. Without the Ruhr, the Nazi war machine could not build another tank, forge another artillery piece, or manufacture another bullet. The American columns were about to cut this vital organ out of the Reich, encircling Model's entire army group in the process. The breakout from Remagen was not just a successful offensive. It was the strategic move that would deliver the final killing blow to the German army in the West. So what, in the final calculus of war, was the true impact of the Ludendorff Bridge? How many lives were saved? How much time was gained? While historians debate the precise figures, the consensus is overwhelming. The capture of the bridge at Remagen was a pivotal moment that dramatically shortened the Second World War in Europe. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the Corps engineer whose men captured and held the bridge, offered a stark and powerful estimate. He calculated that having a single intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months of brutal fighting and prevented an estimated 35,000 casualties. To understand that figure, one only has to look at what was required at other Rhine crossing sites. At Wesel, where Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder unfolded, the Allies assembled over 1,200 artillery pieces, conducted massive airborne drops, and still suffered substantial casualties despite their overwhelming superiority, simply to get across the river. Remagen bypassed that entire bloody amphibious phase. But the impact was more than just a simple advance on the Allied timetable. It was systemic. It fundamentally altered and destroyed Germany's remaining strategic options. Before Remagen, German commanders could still cling to the fantasy of holding the Rhine through the spring, using the time to reinforce the approaches to Berlin and perhaps negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. After Remagen, such calculations were pure delusion. German reserves that should have been used to defend against Montgomery's main crossing in the north were instead sucked into the black hole of the Remagen bridgehead and annihilated in futile counterattacks. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. The Rhine, the mythical barrier they had been told was impregnable, had been breached by a single stroke of luck and daring. Perhaps the most concise and telling assessment came from the Germans themselves. Major General Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Model, stated in a post-war interrogation with the cold clarity of defeat, "The capture of the bridge signaled the end of the war for Germany. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was the moral and strategic collapse of their entire defense of the homeland." After the war, the twisted steel of the Ludendorff Bridge was cleared from the Rhine, but the structure was never rebuilt. Its great stone towers, however, were left standing on both banks, silent, scarred sentinels over a now peaceful river. Today, the western towers house a peace museum, the Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen. Inside, where German machine guns once nested, exhibits now trace the bridge's history, honoring the soldiers on both sides and serving as a powerful plea for peace. On the eastern bank, the towers have been transformed into a space for the performing arts. A place of destruction has been reborn as a place of creation. The soldiers who took the bridge received a grateful nation's highest honors, Lieutenant Timmerman and Sergeant Drabick both received the Distinguished Service Cross. Dozens of others received silver and bronze stars, but no medal could ever fully capture the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Their true reward was measured in the thousands of lives saved, military and civilian. For every single day the war was shortened. The story of Remagen remains a profound lesson in the nature of war and the currents of history. Was it simply a matter of chance? A fog that lifted at the perfect moment? A single stray shell that cut a wire? Or was it a story of human agency, a general's bold decision, an engineer's frantic skill, a young lieutenant's courage, a sergeant's mad dash into fire? The truth is that it was all of these things. It was a perfect, improbable storm where luck provided the opportunity, and brave men seized it without hesitation. In the end, the legacy of the bridge at Remagen returns to the human dimension. The men who crossed that span under fire were not pawns of historical inevitability. They were soldiers, doing their duty in circumstances none of them would have chosen. That their duty on that one hazy afternoon led to outcomes of world historical significance is a timeless testament to the unpredictable nature of war and to the enduring, world-changing power of individual courage.